Hi everybody, my name is Lisa Carringer and I'm the coordinator of the Video Remote Interpreting Project at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. Thanks for logging on, and thanks also to the Interpreter Education Center for inviting me to share my knowledge and experience. And thanks to the interpreter as well. You'll have to forgive my lack of intermittent eye contact with the camera. I'm referencing documents as I'm presenting to keep me guided and going through my presentation, so I do apologize for that. Just to let you know what I'll be talking about today, I am going to review our program at SIU Carbondale, how it started, and just some history, because I know some, and how we do things, because I know some people are logged on to learn how others are doing things. Then I'll move on to the special software and equipment implications in the higher ed environment. Then next I'll go on to touch on some case management issues and student characteristics. And I'll close with some interpreter standards where I kind of get on my soapbox, but we all do that, don't we? I should tell you that the approach we take here at SIU is kind of an action research approach. What we've done is just rolled up our sleeves and started providing services and used that participatory reflective process offered by action research to evaluate what we do, develop a community of practice among our staff interpreters, and then reach out to the rest of the practitioners as well. So the experience that we have being reported to you is based on that action research method. Okay. And then on my first slide there, you'll see the clock tower, the Pulliam Hall clock tower at SIU Carbondale, and you may notice that it becomes audible soon. It goes off every quarter hour. So in 2003, we started hosting test calls with our local community colleges in a simulated classroom experience. And we used some of those old distance classrooms that you find at community colleges and some universities, where all the video remote equipment is in one room with all these big screens. And I think there used to be some federal money connected with that and with starting those kinds of classrooms. And they were successful, good experiences, and we decided this was a viable option for us. And just kind of back up to let you know why we did that. Here at SIU, our Human Resources Department felt that we were taking advantage of our contract interpreters, and so they encouraged us strongly to create staff positions for interpreters. And so we're fortunate in Southern Illinois to have a good qualified pool of interpreters, but we have at the same time a low and fluctuating population of deaf students at our university and at the local community college. So it's kind of a feast or famine environment for interpreters in Southern Illinois. And providing video remote interpreting services was one option that we could use to use those staff interpreters their time wisely. We provide services to the rest of the community as well, but this is just one prong in a 2 or 3 prong effort to keep their time used wisely and offer them real wage earning positions. So that's worked out well. Back in those early days, we noticed that most of the agencies that were providing VRI were doing it on a call-in type basis. And I quickly realized I just couldn't work that way. It didn't fit our workflow here. It couldn't be incorporated easily. And also we felt really strongly that applying the traditional model of interpreting in a higher education environment was important. And that would be consistently scheduled interpreters who are prepared, who have regular contact with the faculty, and that ongoing relationship with the student, and they're invested in the course as well. So we chose to focus exclusively on higher education. We don't provide any medical or business or legal interpreting via video remote. And it's just, we're specialists, it's what we know best, and that's why we chose to do that. So, and then another reason to do it is we want that standard upheld for our students on campus. I wouldn't want an agency to come in and send a different interpreter to every class. I wouldn't want to do that. So we felt like if that's the standard we have here at SIU, the ethical, proper thing to do would be to apply that standard to other students that we're serving, even if it's in the video environment. So that's just a little bit about our program and how we came about doing what we do. Technical stuff, equipment and software. I think on the next slide you'll see an old photograph of the first equipment we used. It's a television with an old Polycom VSX camera on it. I love that thing. It's in the junk room now. But you know, we used to wheel it in and provide services, and so at the receiving institution, very likely it was that a IT professional would wheel it in, and hook it up, and make sure the microphone was running, and that was one of the really good advantages to providing services on this kind of antiquated equipment now, but there was a ready IT support there in the room when you started the call. So that was a really nice part of it. And of course the picture was great because the coding and encoding in the camera kind of make the call go well. So as I move throughout talking about equipment and software, I should let you know I am not a technical person. I have just enough knowledge to be dangerous. I use the equipment. I teach others how to use it, teach deaf students how to use it, but I don't know about how it works and the details about how it works. But my point here is to tell you some of the things that are different in the higher ed environment as opposed maybe to other environments where video remote's being provided. It is kind of amazing, though, to back up about the equipment, how quickly it's all changed. That was just in the first few years that we provided services, like 2004, 2005, and now we're doing it all on laptop. So that is interesting. So the basic configuration that we're seeing people use now, our client institution, is a laptop with peripheral equipment, so an outboard camera and a wireless USB port microphone. Microphones are really important in the higher ed environment and the education environment, because when you think about the acoustics of the room and trying to focus on the one person's voice, the faculty person's voice, maybe a few comments from students, it is a bit different than maybe a small examination room in a hospital or a lawyer's office or maybe even a courtroom, depending on the size of it. So microphones can be problematic, but they're also especially important to be able to hear all the players in the room. At SIU, with our laptop and peripheral equipment, we provide on what's called a Polycom CMA, a converged management application. It's a lot like content management applications where you see the PowerPoint and the interpreter or the other person on the other end, the interpreter, and then there's a chat feature as well. And so that's what I think is one of the advantages of video remote, and probably what I would say the only advantage over having an on-site interpreter is that sight line, the opportunity offers for a good, clear sight line for the deaf student where they can see the interpreter in the PowerPoint right next to the interpreter, chat quickly with the interpreter if they have a question and they don't want to sign it or whatever. It really is a good way to focus your attention on the content and offering that sightline advantage. I forgot to mention that USB microphones on the instructor are important, but if you're anticipating in a classroom where there might be some discussion among a smaller number of students, not a giant lecture hall, but omnidirectional microphones are also beneficial and can do a really good job of picking up student comments when there is discussion. I've even had a student in a classroom where we had an omnidirectional. I could pick up discussion and comments from the students, and then when it was time to break into small group, he just moved the microphone and sat it in the middle of the small group. So those are really beneficial too in the higher ed environment. Okay, I wanted to touch on equipment and software on the Department of Justice regulations that implemented the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended. The DOJ regulations are for Title II, but of course deference is given regardless of the agency that develops the regs or the title that you're working in. So these are good guidelines for us to all pay attention to as we're working with clients in the video remote environment. So training is a must now, most especially for your clients or students using the platform. And I'm just reading right from the regs now. It says that the video remote interpreting must provide high quality, clear, real-time, full motion video and audio over a dedicated high-speed internet connection. 2, it says a clear, sufficiently large and sharply delineated picture of the participating individual's head, arms, hands, fingers, regardless of body position, of course, but I guess they had to put it in there. Clear transmission of voices, back to the microphone issue for higher ed. And then 4, the curious one I've noted, and it kind of makes us more responsible for making sure people understand how to use this stuff. It says adequate training to users of the technology, other involved individuals, so that they may quickly and efficiently set up and operate the VRI. So setting it up and operating it, maybe that setting it up might be the IT person. Operating it may or may not be the deaf student, depending on your institution and how independent the deaf student feels. But it's not just about the hardware. You have to think about the software. Has the deaf student used that content management style software before? Lots have, of course, but some may not have. It doesn't work just like video relay, so it does look different in terms of the document sharing and the content that you can share on those platforms. So there's my word of caution about training our students. And future of the equipment. I've got that funny little picture of Will Ferrell with his tiny little phone. Things are getting so small. Of course, a tablet or iPad is probably where we're going, or other web machines that make it easy, lightweight, portable, and they're made for receiving video media over the internet. I mean, it's going to be something that you'll find institutions using, and I know there are some agencies working with students who are using iPads now. The peripheral equipment's kind of contained in it. I haven't used it yet to see what the microphone is like. You know, if the iPad's facing the student and the teacher is in the front of the classroom, is it going to pick up the teacher's voice? I don't know. So maybe the iPad 3 with the USB port will allow still a microphone in the higher ed environment. I don't know about an iPhone though, receiving a course lectured on an iPhone. I'm not a deaf student, so I don't know, but it seems kind of small to me, but we'll see. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about case management. And I think this is really important for providers who may not work in the higher ed environment in other aspects of their professional career, or who have not had that experience prior, that when you're working with a coordinator of services, and remember very often VRI is being used on a campus where there are fewer deaf students, not more. Now there are some configurations I know Bambi has covered where there are a lot of deaf students within a university system, and they're using VRI to provide to their own students in-house. Different situation, but when you're talking about providing services to the one deaf student in rural Michigan or Arizona or wherever it be, very often you're dealing with a coordinator who doesn't have a background in deafness. And historically, when you work with a coordinator like that, they have hired an on-site interpreter, sent them to the classroom, and the problem is solved. You know, the interpreter handles all the communication management, gets the materials directly from the faculty. Everything is sort of handled and solved by placing that interpreter, or very often that might be the perspective that they have. You know, the interpreter is available to troubleshoot note-taking issues and to refer the faculty to the right office and refer the student back to the coordinator if there are problems with the course. But I'm proposing that coordinators need to understand that the skills they use in sort of unpacking a class and really understanding how to provide academic accommodations or adjustments for any student, maybe intensive services for a student who's blind, or intensive services for a student who has mobility impairments, should be applied to using VRI. So by virtue of using VRI, what I want DSS professionals or disability support professionals to avoid assuming that the mere contracting of the VRI service means they're done, because very often it doesn't. The video remote interpreter needs some assistance in kind of managing all those variables that we're talking about, that Bambi touched on. So we don't want to step in and interrupt the coordinator's workflow, but we want to encourage them in the right direction in terms of providing real access to the deaf student. And then, to piggyback on that, effective communication has to be based on the individual student in that individual course at that time. So there's lots of variables there. So earlier in my slide, we talked about the Department of Justice regulations, where it sort of puts a seal of approval on VRI. If we train them and we've got good, clear picture, this means we can use it. Well, I'm saying that we have to still ensure that the communication is effective. Very often VRI is not effective in some classrooms, and we have to make sure that we're looking at the specific class, the specific types of communication, the instructor's pedagogical intent, how they're presenting material, and the level of involvement in the class, and all those variables we've been talking about today. And we have to make that decision to use VRI on those individual needs of the student in that individual class, not the bottom line. And then also, even if there are some courses that are going to fit, where it will work well, their lecture format, good connection, good easy flow of communication between the faculty and the interpreter, and all these wonderful variables are contained and worked to the benefit of the deaf student, we still want to look at hiring on-site interpreters where it's appropriate for events, for meetings and things like that, to make sure that the student, is included in the institution. Oh, and one more important thing about unpacking that class and making sure you're understanding that the communication will be effective is to, a lot of times coordinators will tell me that something is a lecture class, and they read it from the course description or make note of how the course is categorized as a lecture course, and that's not enough, because faculty make their own individual choices in how to teach things. And especially today in higher education, I'm finding that faculty are using a lot of different modalities to get content across. They are using that kind of universal design approach to teaching, where they use multiple means of teaching the material to students. And so when you use multiple means, it makes it kind of buggy for VRI. So we want to make sure that we look at the class in detail and have contact with the individual faculty member too, to understand what type of course we're dealing with before we decide it's appropriate for video remote. Student characteristics, I don't know what else to call it. It's not really a great way to describe it, but it's just some of my experiences over the years with students who are successful with video remote tend to be this type of student who have some level of self-advocacy. And by that I mean a student who can say, this isn't going to work for this discussion class I have, it'll be great for this lecture class. Just a student who knows how to, knows their rights and knows how to communicate that to the coordinator. Ideally, they should be open to using video remote. If they're not, I'm not sure it will work. If a student is resistant, do you want to be the person who forces it on a student? You want to be involved in that configuration. Back to the self-advocacy issue, they need to be mature enough to handle the independence possibly required. And by that I mean, are we dealing with a deaf student who is maybe trying to acquire some academic skills, maybe some language skills in an English class, learning the routine of college and acquiring new study skills? All of that's so new for a student. We have a deaf student in a at a state university, and maybe they're the one of only just a handful, and then we layer all this hidden curriculum, as it's known, on top of that student to say, okay, now you have to learn how to use these DSS services, you have to learn how to request a note taker, you have to learn how to request an interpreter. Everything's different from the K through 12 environment, especially if they've been mainstreamed. And then now we're all of a sudden asking them to be super independent and get all these services lined up and let the coordinator know what they need, and then add another layer of video remote using new technology in the classroom. So a caution would be that you want to use it with students who are familiar with the role of the interpreter, feel empowered, feel like they can self-advocate, and just feel ready to use video remote. I've found it's more successful with other classmen or very highly independent freshmen. Again, students need to be trained in the platform, so they need to be comfortable, the type of student who's comfortable with technology. You know, I'm in my mid-40s, so technology freaks me out, but I think that students coming through higher ed today are probably more comfortable than I am, and it's seamless to them. So I shouldn't put my own fears in learning to use technology on a student, but sometimes there are students who haven't had a lot of exposure to computers and using the different kinds of platforms and that content management type of software. So one thing to caution about is troubleshooting, and the institution needs to decide if they're going to place that responsibility on the student, which is debatable. Things do go wrong in the video remote environment. Sometimes a microphone goes dead, or sometimes the battery dies, or the wrong microphone is selected in the software. The student needs to feel comfortable, if the institution is asking the student to use the technology, in troubleshooting that quickly with the assistance of the video remote interpreter. Interpreters need to be trained on the equipment too, to troubleshoot quickly without interrupting the content of the class. We don't want them to lose information when there's a glitch. Okay, interpreter standards. A lot of this relates to the next point I make. It's all kind of intertwined. Being a video interpreter can make you pull your hair out sometimes. It can be very frustrating. And on that note, referencing the Via Video Work Team's research in 2009, where they identified effective practice, interpreters need to be able to calmly manage the communication. They need to have grace under pressure and be able to just manage that communication without losing their ethical framework. So being able to focus in on the student, give the camera the eye contact, and not feel disoriented by not being present in the classroom, because it can be disorienting. And again, training the interpreters to feel comfortable with the equipment, to have PowerPoints available for them to look at. We even scan textbooks sometimes if it's a highly technical class with mathematics or chemistry, so we can see the problems that are being worked from the textbook as we're interpreting. It's helpful. The next interpreter standard that I feel is really important to uphold, especially in a video remote environment, is that they need to be consistently scheduled. Now, this is not K through 12, but this is higher ed. And that I've already said, previously stated, that that's the way we do business. We consistently schedule the same interpreter throughout the semester. Again, VRI is most likely happening in an environment with few deaf students. You know, the deaf student is one of the only students on campus, or one of the only students in the class. And I just don't feel that real inclusion can take place unless the interpreter gets to know the personalities in the class and the flavor of the instructor's lecture. And having that consistently scheduled interpreter provides that relationship to the deaf student and for the interpreter, so that everyone's feeling comfortable and can make a more accurate interpretation. Provides for that prior knowledge, frame of reference for the ongoing content. I was sort of knocking this around with Bambi, and we were thinking, well, do deaf students want that? Are we just applying our own values on the educational setting for them? And it may vary. It's conceivable that it could vary according to the student's familiarity with the topic and the material. Maybe you have a very highly prepared student who's fully engaged and feels very comfortable with the material, and they're very competent, this upper level student, and all other things being worked out and equal, perhaps they would feel it's less critical to have the same interpreter for the entire duration of the course. So maybe we need to collect some data on that, perhaps. Prepared, that's my other soapbox item, and it goes along with being consistently scheduled and qualified, but it's needed. Preparation in higher ed is of course needed because some of the content can get very difficult. You need to understand it to interpret it. And it helps to compensate for not being physically present and not being able to refer to the overhead and that sort of thing. And it keeps the interpreter in that loop to be able to provide a more accurate interpretation. And referencing again the Via Video team's findings, one of the things they did find was that the deaf consumers of VRI felt that an interpreter with the knowledge and skills for the specific VRI setting was important. So I haven't touched on whether or not an interpreter should be certified, and very often we're dealing with situations where the interpreter is practicing in a state where, of course, we're licensed and most of us have our certification here at SIU, but you're broadcasting to another state where the required credentials and experience may be different. But just for one example, I have one interpreter on staff who is not certified, and she's got about 20 years experience working at the community college level, and she has worked welding I don't know how many times. She is our go-to person for vocational programs. She's worked auto body and auto mechanics. She knows the material, she knows the vocabulary, she's learned it from deaf students. I feel like she's qualified for those vocational type courses where she, when a welding class comes up, she knows all the different welds, the different angles that someone can weld from, and the joints, and it just comes right off her hands, and it's not something she has to learn to understand or study to understand. She's prepared and qualified in that setting. But maybe that's something we can discuss in terms of interpreter qualifications in the video remote environment. Wow, I burned through that. I'm ready to present my questions, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion online and developing some contacts. My first question is, should VRI agencies or interpreters assume the responsibility to help students advocate for an on-site interpreter when appropriate? The other question I want to throw out at you is it misplacing the responsibility of the accommodation on the student to have them transport and set up equipment on their own rather than a tech support to deliver it to each class? And then, kind of a moot point, I suppose, but will the use of tablets or iPads or web machines change how VRI is used in post-secondary environments? And that's what I've got for you today. I appreciate your time and your attention, and I look forward to a productive discussion of the issues. Thank you.